Good morning, everyone. We are going to get started this morning. Thank you so much for joining us for Seed Oils, Sorting Facts from Fiction in the Fat Debate. My name is Sarah Alsager. I'm Director of Communications and Outreach for Soy Nutrition Institute Global. We are pleased to let you know that this session has been accredited by the Commission on Dietetic Registration for 1 CPEU. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers this morning. First, starting with a couple of disclosures, Whitney English is a speaker for the Soy Nutrition Institute Global and is a video host for Fit On, and Mark Messina is an employee of Soy Nutrition Institute Global. We have two exceptional speakers with us to present to you on this session today. Dr. Mark Messina is the Director of Nutrition Science and Research for Soy Nutrition Institute Global. Over the past 3 decades, Mark has devoted his time to the study of the health effects of soy foods and soybean components, such as isoflavones, soy protein, and soybean oil. He writes extensively on these subjects. Having published more than 100 peer-reviewed articles, he's given more than 800 presentations to consumer and professional groups in more than 55 countries. We can pretty safely say he's the world's foremost expert on soy for human health and nutrition. He is also the chairperson of the editorial advisory board and writes a regular column for The Soy Connection, a quarterly newsletter that reaches health professionals, including dietitians. He's organized and chaired 10 international symposia on the role of soy in preventing and treating chronic disease, and he's also the co-author of 3 books. Whitney English is a registered dietitian, author, recipe developer, and nutrition communicator. She is the founder of the nutrition education platform Whitney ERD and co-founder of Plant-Based Juniors, a multimedia company dedicated to helping parents and professionals optimize plant-based diets for kids. Her guidance has helped thousands of families improve their health by bringing more flavor and fun to the table. These are the learning objectives that we have set out to share today and really provide an overview of the session. We're going to identify common claims made against seed oils. We are going to evaluate the current scientific evidence regarding the health effects of seed oils. And we are going to also strengthen the role of the registered dietitian as frontline educators on these topics. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Whitney to the stage to begin our session.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Whitney English. So can I see by a raise of hands how many of you are active on social media? Yeah, most people. And how many of you have seen attacks online of seed oils? Pretty much the same amount. Yeah, so if you're active on social media, then you've no doubt noticed the rise over the past few years of uncredentialed health experts touting nutrition misinformation and targeting a wide range of boogeyman ingredients and foods online. Their latest target, seed oils. The claims against seed oils are widespread, and they range from the questionable to the clearly false to the wildly absurd. Influencers claim that seed oils cause everything from mental health issues like depression and anxiety to chronic health conditions like cancer, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes, to cognitive disorders like ADHD and autism, to extremely bizarre things like labor pain, sunburns, and believe it or not, even gun violence. Yeah, hard to believe. The posts on the right here are just a few of the thousands of inflammatory things that are being said about seed oils on Instagram. If you search the hashtag seed oils, about 24,000 posts will come up. And if you Google seed oils are toxic, about 24 million. Yeah. So where did all of this hysteria originate? Well, seed oil misinformation seems to have begun circulating around 2018, about the same time as the rise in popularity of the popular carnivore diet, as it's called. Some trace its origin also to an online article claiming that canola oil had been banned in the European Union, which we all know is patently false. Around the same time, an orthopedic surgeon by the name of Sean Baker released this book, The Carnivore Diet, in which he claimed that seed oils were toxic, likely as an attempt to justify the high saturated fat content of the meat and animal exclusive diet that he was pushing. Other influencers jumped on the bandwagon, people like Jordan Peterson, the Liver King, who since went down in a big steroid controversy. Kate Shanahan right here, a doctor who coined the term the hateful eight in reference to the most widely used seed oils. And of course, everybody's favorite Instagram psychiatrist, Dr. Paul Saladino. You may recognize him as the Carnivore MD. Saladino regularly targets seed oils on his social media channels, as well as on podcasts like the Joe Rogan Experience, in which some of these episodes have gotten 11 million listeners. The irony is that since then, Saladino has actually gone on to admit that the carnivore diet caused him many health complications, things like decreased testosterone, muscle cramps, sleep disturbances, heart palpitations, and he actually started incorporating fruits, vegetables, dairy, and honey back into his diet. Go figure. But his attacks on seed oils have not lost their intensity. He continues to make his videos. Opposition to seed oils took on a new fervor when it entered the political sphere, and some health officials began claiming that seed oils were the cause of our chronic disease and obesity epidemic. Adding fuel to this fire, seed oil opponents claim that not only are they horrible for our health, but that the government is knowingly adding them to the food system in order to appease the food industry and keep people sick. And this also aligns with the idea that health professionals and dietitians like us are in bed with big pharma, and we're all in on this. This also aligns with other conspiracy theories that were gaining momentum in around 2020 with the COVID denial and vaccine skepticism. All of these disparate but converging viewpoints have muddled together over the past few years to create a toxic soup of seed oil misinformation. So now let's talk about how the public is perceiving this information. These are the results from a recent US study looking at seed oil perception and consumption amongst consumers. It's not as bad as you might think. The majority of people, 46%, believe that seed oils are healthy, while only 13% said they believe they're unhealthy. The rest had no opinion or they didn't know. 4 in 10 had heard positive or mostly positive information about seed oils, while only 1 in 10 had heard negative information. And 25% had never heard the term seed oils at all. Unfortunately, 28% said they are actively avoiding seed oils. But here's the interesting part. Most people couldn't even accurately identify what a seed oil was. When asked about certain oils like safflower, peanut, soybean, walnut, they didn't even know that these were seed oils. So this really highlights just how far this conversation is off from facts. And that really isn't surprising when we look at where these facts are coming from. Most people are getting their information from friends and family and social media, not from evidence-based health professionals. So this really highlights an important point for dietitians where we can step in and redirect this conversation. And now is more important than ever. There is already policy in place and coming to fight against seed oils. Some states are already requiring people to label on the restaurant menus if there are seed oils in different foods, and there is a push to try to get them out of the food system. So it's really important that we as dietitians stand up and combat this misinformation. And to lead us in the right direction, we've got Dr. Mark Messina to share with us some evidence-based information, bring some clarity to this conversation.
Thank you, man. That was excellent. And Whitney mentioned 28% of folks in this country are actively avoiding seed oils. One of those is my sister. It's good to be here with you this morning here in San Antonio and to have some time to discuss the seed oil controversy. At my age, I'm reluctant to buy green bananas. And so I think it will mean something to you when I say during my relatively long career, I've never witnessed a nutrition controversy, and there have been many over the years that have less evidence of supporting it. I think just the fact that seed oils or vegetable oils are now commonly referred to as seed oils indicates the extent to which this controversy has actually impacted a nutrition lexicon. And in response to chatter on the internet about seed oils, I published a paper on soybean oil, a review paper, 4 years ago, which means I was writing it 5 years ago. But I never would have imagined the extent to which the opposition to seed oils has achieved the success that it has. And by the way, Sarah mentioned my conflicts of interest. She forgot one, which is that I regularly consume seed oils. So before looking at the evidence, I want to go over fatty acid nomenclature. I realize this is going to be a review for many of you, but I'll just spend a minute or so on this topic. Fatty acids are really named or designated by the number of carbons in their chain length, the number of double bonds, and the position of the double bond. So a double bond is a connection between two carbon atoms that is not saturated with hydrogen atoms. You can see down at the bottom right that fatty acids are long chains of carbons and hydrogen atoms, and at one end of the fatty acid chain is a methyl group, and that's also referred to as the omega end. So let's take a look at the major dietary fatty acids, beginning first with the major saturated fatty acid, palmitic acid, 16 carbons in length, no double bonds. Next, we have the major monounsaturated fat in the diet, oleic acid. It's monounsaturated because it has one double bond, and it's an omega-9 fatty acid because the first carbon-carbon double bond occurs at carbon 9 from the methyl end. Next, we have the two essential fatty acids. They're both 18 carbons in length, beginning with linoleic acid. This is an omega-6 fatty acid because the first carbon-carbon double bond occurs of carbon 6 from the methyl end. And then we have the omega-3 essential fatty acid, alpha-linolenic acid, 3 double bonds, also 18 carbons in length, an omega-3 fatty acid because the first carbon-carbon double bond occurs at carbon 3 from the methyl end. So again, linoleic acid is the major, represents about 90% of all PUFA intake. Alpha-linoleic acid is the major omega-3 fatty acid in our diet. So why the hate for seed oils? Well, there are a lot of reasons. We're going to cover all those. But the main one, at least initially, is because seed oils are high in linoleic acid. And there's no dispute about this point. Here we have 8 seed oils listed, and you can see that for 6 of them, linoleic acid accounts for at least 50% of the total fat content. Now, you can also see that rice bran and canola oil are relatively low in linoleic acid, so you may question why they're on the list. But they're much higher in linoleic acid than palm oil and olive oil, which are 2 oils the anti-seed oil folks would much prefer you consume over the others listed on this slide. Well, how much linoleic acid should we consume? Of course, that's a matter of debate. The American Heart Association, in a paper published in 2009, recommends that we consume 5 to 10% of our calories in the form of linoleic acid. How much do we actually consume in this country? Let's take a look at some Haynes data published over the past 20 years. 3 different surveys. There are about 5,000 adults in each of these different surveys. First, we get about 12% of our calories from saturated fat. That's above the 10% recommendation, which was issued decades ago. And we get about 7.5 to 8% of our calories from polyunsaturated fat. Again, linoleic acid accounts for about 90% of our PUFA intake. So that 8% falls pretty much in the middle of the recommendation by the American Heart Association. Here are some other concerns raised by the anti-seed oil folks, and I'm going to go through each one. First, that they're a modern addition to the diet. There are exceptions to this generalization. For example, there's archaeological evidence indicating that folks were consuming sesame seed oil as long as 3,000 years ago, and also peanut oil has a fairly long history of consumption beginning in the middle of the 1800s. But for the most part, prior to the 1950s, at least in this country, the major sources of added fat were from animals, either beef, lard, butter, or we have hydrogenated vegetable oils. That situation changed pretty dramatically beginning in about the 1950s, early 1960s, with the emergence in the popularity of seed oils, and specifically soybean oil. Soybean oil actually accounts for about 7% of our caloric intake and over 40% of our intake of both essential fatty acids. So I would say seed oils are a relatively new addition to the diet. What about the fact that they're highly processed? Well, that's a very subjective term, but it does take a fair amount of processing to go from an ear of corn to a tablespoon of corn oil. And if you're interested in this topic, I suggest reading this paper published in Nutrition Today. It's open access, so anybody can download it. It goes through the extraction, degumming, refining, bleaching, and deodorization steps. If you want a more technical review of this topic, I suggest this paper by Garby, published in 2022. So again, although this is a subjective term, I'm willing to acknowledge that seed oils, for the most part, are highly processed. But I think a really important point to always come back to is that the question isn't what happens to the oil. The question is what happens to you when you consume the oil. You can debate about processing and whether it's high or low in linoleic acid. What we care about is how it impacts our health. What about the notion that seed oils have a high omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio? And again, when we're talking about omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio, we're talking really about the ratio of linoleic acid to linolenic acid, because these are the main two omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in the diet. So what's considered to be a high ratio? Well, there's some evidence to suggest hunter-gatherers, Paleolithic man, may have had or consumed a diet with the fatty acid ratio of about 2 to 1. Estimates are, based on disappearance data, that in the US, back around 1900, our omega-6, omega-3 ratio may have been about 5 to 1, and then over the next 100 years or so, that pretty much doubled. And that's not surprising because we've already covered the fact that seed oils are predominantly omega-6 fatty acids, linoleic acid. Most of them have either no or very low levels of omega-3 fatty acids. So in some cases, you actually can't even calculate a ratio. And in those that have a little bit, you can see the ratio is extremely high. And I would say the two major exceptions are soybean oil and canola oil, ratio of about 8 to 1 and about 2 to 1. Current data suggests our omega-6, omega-3 ratio is about 10 to 1. So I would say, again, it's subjective that our ratio is relatively high, but I consider our high ratio to be completely irrelevant. And that's because current thinking is that this ratio is no longer considered to be a measure of diet quality because both types of fatty acids are thought to be beneficial. So this notion that a high omega-6 omega-3 ratio causes chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, and adversely affects health is completely outdated. I confess that's what I learned when I was going through school and probably held that view until about 15 or 20 years ago. And if you want to read about this topic and all the limitations and lack of utility of this ratio, I would suggest reading this paper by Bill Harris. He's one of the experts in this field. In this paper, he notes the use of omega-3, omega-6 ratio is based on invalid assumptions, and it's time to move beyond the omega-6, omega-3 ratio. And here is just a partial list of internationally recognized health organizations that either have concluded that this ratio is uninformative or have not commented about the utility of the ratio because they know it is uninformative. Probably the major concerns raised initially was that linoleic acid causes inflammation and oxidative stress. And those are important criticisms of seed oils because, as you know, inflammation is thought to be at the root of most chronic diseases. But the evidence to suggest linoleic acid increases inflammation is virtually non-existent. Here we have in 2012 a meta-analysis and systematic review of 15 randomized controlled trials. A couple years later, systematic review and meta-analysis of 30 RCTs. And then in 2021, a meta-analysis of 30 randomized controlled trials. Now in the last meta-analysis, most of those trials actually dealt specifically with IBS, but there were a handful of studies that they focused on that looked specifically at inflammatory markers. None of these papers concluded that linoleic acid increases the inflammatory process. So why was it, and in some cases, some people still think it is, that linoleic acid causes inflammation? What was the basis for that assumption? Well, it's shown here. It was thought that linoleic acid would be converted in our bodies in vivo to another longer chain omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid, arachidonic acid. And from arachidonic acid, you would make a bunch of compounds, some of which are called eicosanoids, that would increase inflammation and then increase coronary heart disease risk. So let's just focus on that first step, the conversion, the in vivo conversion of linoleic acid to arachidonic acid. This is a paper published in 2011 by Rhett and Whalen, very important analysis. They concluded after looking at a whole series of randomized controlled trials that intervention studies bring no evidence to suggest that changes in linoleic acid will modify tissue arachidonic acid content in an adult population consuming a Western-style diet. So this is such an important paper. It's often overlooked. So let's take a look at this graph from the paper. Down at the horizontal axis, you see the relative increase in linoleic acid. It actually, in some of these studies, they increase linoleic acid intake as much as 10-fold. On the vertical axis, you have the change in either plasma serum levels or plasma phospholipid levels of arachidonic acid. And you can see there's absolutely no change in levels of arachidonic acid despite these huge increases in dietary linoleic acid intake. This is a more recently published paper that concluded plasma arachidonic acid concentrations did not change throughout the intervention in any dietary group, including the group with the linoleic acid intake lowered to 3.2% of energy intake. You recall a bunch of slides ago, average linoleic acid intake in the United States is about 8%. So they cut linoleic acid intake by more than half, and they still found no effect on arachidonic acid. So this notion that linoleic acid is converted to arachidonic acid, for all intents and purposes, is really not correct. Furthermore, some of the compounds produced from arachidonic acid actually produce or lead or have anti-inflammatory effects. There's a very complex set of molecules produced from arachidonic acid. What about the notion that linoleic acid increases oxidative stress? Now, it is true that these double bonds in polyunsaturated fatty acids, both omega-6 and omega-3, are highly susceptible to oxidation, and that can be a bad thing because oxidative stress is thought to be a major factor, along with inflammation, in the etiology of chronic diseases. This bond is susceptible to oxidation, which is why you need to store your seed oils high in PUFA, in a dark location at room temperature. You want to keep the lid tightly closed to prevent oxygen exposure. And importantly, you want to buy amounts that are going to be used in months rather than a year or so. Now, Eric Decker, a food scientist at the University of Amherst, actually recommends that you store seed oils in the refrigerator, which I do now as a result of his comment, and that if you're buying large amounts like you see people do at box stores, that you consider dividing it into smaller portions and freezing the portions that you're not going to use for a while. So these oils are subject to oxidation. But one of my favorite all-time quotes in the field of nutrition comes from Martha Belluri, PhD RD from Ohio State. "We are not a bottle of vegetable oil." What she means by that is we possess enzymatic and non-enzymatic mechanisms dealing or able to neutralize free radicals and reactive oxygen species. And if you look at this review published by Tom Sanders, and there are a lot of papers that have reached a similar conclusion, this was published in 2019, there is no evidence that higher intakes of linoleic acid increase lipid peroxidation or increase LDL oxidation in vivo. And then finally, let's take a look at whether linoleic acid and seed oils increase risk of CVD, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and obesity. Because again, as I mentioned before, what matters is what effect linoleic acid and seed oils have on our health, clinically relevant outcomes, not even markers of inflammation or oxidative stress. What we care about is heart disease, diabetes, and so on. So let's take a look at these conditions, beginning first with cardiovascular disease. And for that, I want to turn to an analysis of the Nurses' Health Study and Health Professional Follow-Up Study out of Harvard. An important conclusion from this study is that the replacement for saturated fat in the diet determines whether cardiovascular disease risk is lowered. It's not enough to simply lower saturated fat content, as you'll see in just a moment. So this study analysis involved 85,000 women, nurses, 43,000 men. Diet was assessed every 4 years. They were followed for 24 to 30 years, and during that time, there were about 8,000 heart attacks and coronary heart disease deaths. And now we're looking at the effects on coronary heart disease risk as a result of replacing 5% of energy from saturated fat with 5% of energy from different sources. So if you replace saturated fat with calorie from refined carbohydrate, your risk actually increases a bit. Now, this was not a statistically significant effect, but it's really not surprising because we know refined carbohydrates adversely affect heart disease risk. Conversely, if you replace your calories with carbohydrate from whole grains, monounsaturated fat, and PUFA, risk is reduced 9%, 15%, and 25%. Three of those findings were statistically significant after adjusting for a wide range of potentially confounding variables. What about diabetes? For that, I want to turn to a meta-analysis of 102 randomized controlled trials. So huge database, 239 diet arms, over 4,000 adults were included in these 102 trials. So we're looking at the effects of replacing 5% of energy from saturated fat with equivalent energy from polyunsaturated fat. Almost all of it is going to be linoleic acid. And what we see, that replacement ends up lowering blood glucose levels, HbA1c, fasting insulin, C-peptide, which is related to insulin, and it decreases insulin resistance, so you're more sensitive to the hormone. This is an analysis from the Nordic nutrition recommendations that came out in 2023. They conducted 2 systematic reviews of their own They also looked at 21 systematic reviews and a meta-analysis and 70 other biomarker papers as well. They found replacement of saturated fat with PUFA improves lipid profile, decreases CVD risk, improves glucose insulin homeostasis, may decrease overall mortality. Both N6 and omega-3 are associated with low risk of diabetes, and you also see a lower cancer mortality. What about obesity? This is in the last year or two, this is one of the main concerns raised about linoleic acid and seed oil consumption. And on a lot of sites that are opposed to seed oil use, you see this kind of ecological observation. We know how worthless this kind of correlation is, but you see the really nice correlation between the rise in obesity and the rise in vegetable oils. But a lot of society changes have happened over the past 70 years that likely have contributed to obesity. So we can't reach any conclusions about this kind of ecological observation. But here we have a cross-sectional analysis of NHANES data between 2011 and 2018. Higher omega-3 and omega-6 intakes may contribute to reduced obesity risk by lowering body fat percent. This study involved over 6,000 individuals. Their diet was assessed by 2 24-hour recalls for each cycle, NHANES cycle. They used DEXA to determine body fat percent. And it was found that for each increase in omega-3 fatty acids, there's about a 1% decrease in body fat content. And for each 0.8 gram increase in omega-6 fatty acid intake, there's also about a 1% decrease in body fat. Now, this is a cross-sectional analysis, and among epidemiologists, cross-sectional analysis don't carry a huge amount of weight. They're obviously better than ecological observations, but you really need to look to cohort longitudinal data if you're going to make any really robust conclusions. So let's do that right now. This is a fascinating study published earlier this year. Plasma phospholipid proportions of linoleic acid and alpha-linoleic acid, biomarkers of vegetable oil intake, during childhood and adolescence were inversely associated with measures of obesity and cardiometabolic health in young adulthood. So we're looking at what children and adolescents eat and whether that affects body weight later on in life. So this is a study from Sweden, 700 participants. They were followed until age 24 years, and they measured plasma phospholipids at age 8 and 16. And what they found is that for each 1% increase in plasma linoleic acid content at age 8 and 16, there was a decrease in body mass index, waist circumference, and fat mass percent at age 24 years. Now, these associations were only found in females, not in males. And in females, there was also an association between linoleic acid and lower blood pressure levels, triglycerides, and LDL cholesterol. Next, I want to talk about a study that looked at adipose tissue linoleic acid content and overall mortality. Of course, all-cause mortality is the ultimate endpoint, and it's an important study because it's not looking at blood levels of linoleic acid, it's looking at adipose tissue content. And that's important because blood levels may only reflect linoleic acid intake over the past 1 or 2 days. Adipose tissue likely reflects intake over the past year or two because of the slow turnover of adipose tissue. And in fact, from this 2015 paper, you can see that the adipose tissue, the linoleic acid adipose tissue content over the past 50 years has increased quite dramatically among Americans, reflecting our increased intake of seed oils. So for this study from Denmark that involved 5,000 individuals, the investigators divided the participants, into 4 groups according to the amount of linoleic acid in their adipose tissue. And they found those with the highest adipose tissue linoleic acid content had a 24% reduced risk of dying from all-cause mortality. All three of those differences were statistically significant, and again, they controlled for a wide range of potentially confounding variables. What about brain health, cognitive function, and dementia? This is a relatively newer area of research. This is a very large study from the UK Biobank, 170,000 individuals. They filled out validated food frequency questionnaires up to 5 times between 2009 and 2021. And they found that low omega-6 fatty acid intake, low intake, was associated with a 30% increased risk of dementia, 42% increased risk of Parkinson's, 65% increased risk of MS, and there were also diminished volumes of various brain structures. And then finally, all of the information I've discussed so far has really looked at the relationship between linoleic acid and a variety of different health outcomes. Far fewer papers have actually focused specifically on the sources of linoleic acid and looking at various seed oils. So this paper compared plant oils with butter. It was an analysis of 3 US prospective studies, 220,000 individuals, Nurses Health Study 1 and 2, Health Professional Follow-Up Study. Diet was assessed every 4 years. Over the 33 years that the participants were followed, there were 50,000 deaths, 51,000 deaths, so again, it's a huge data set. And just due to time constraints, I'll just point out that substituting 10 grams per day intake of butter with an equivalent amount of plant-based oils was associated with an estimated 17% reduction in total mortality. And when they looked at specific causes of mortality, there was a decrease in cancer mortality, which I really haven't discussed so far, as well as overall mortality. So I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that linoleic acid or seed oils increases CVD, diabetes, cancer, obesity, or any of the other chronic diseases that Americans face. Just to point out some of the data limitations, most data, epidemiologic evidence, comes from a limited number of cohort studies. There are about 10 huge cohort studies underway around the world that have provided data on linoleic acid and seed oils. And most of the information comes from linoleic acid intake. Far few studies have looked at specific seed oils. I did point out one study that looked at adipose tissue content rather than relying on dietary intake or even blood levels. The randomized control trials mostly look at markers. They're not looking at like cardiovascular disease events for the most part. They're relatively short term. Again, they focus on risk factors, not events. And in this country, baseline linoleic acid intake is typically quite high. And if I can digress for a minute, one of the criticisms of the epidemiologic data by the anti-seed oil folks is that they believe even in the lowest intake group in epi studies, linoleic acid is already causing adverse effects, so you're not going to see more of an adverse effect when you're already meeting a certain threshold. But that would not explain all the multitude of studies that show higher intake of linoleic acid actually reduces risk. So just in conclusion, the bulk of the clinical and observational evidence indicates that when consumed within recommended intakes, linoleic acid and oils high in this fatty acid promote overall health. So it's not just a question of these oils being safe, they're actually beneficial. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was wonderful. It's truly astonishing that with this bulk of evidence, we're still seeing so much misinformation. Okay, so now that we have the science in our hands, let's talk about how to translate that to applicable knowledge and tools for our clients. So the first step is meeting clients where they're at. I know how easy it is when we hear these outrageous claims to just dismiss them outright. But research really shows that validating patients' concerns and anxieties before initiating nutrition education is crucial to improving patient engagement and health outcomes. So we want to start by gathering information. Where are they getting this from? Is it from social media? Who are the influencers that they're listening to? Is it from friends and family? Really finding out the source of the information. Next, we want to find out exactly what their specific concerns are. For some people, it's this idea of processing. For others, it might be certain chronic health conditions. Knowing which concerns that they have will help direct your conversation as to combating the myths. And of course, we want to know how they're taking this information and applying it to their diet. Are they cutting out foods or different food groups? Because there can really be unintended consequences, as we know, when people change up their diet or remove things that are healthy and replace them with other things. So first, it's important to listen and to gather information. And of course, you want to use open-ended questions to provoke thoughtful conversation. Now, once you've validated their concerns and identified what the specific concerns are, you want to use clear and concise evidence-based responses. And Mark has equipped us with all of the information we need to answer these things thoroughly. So these are some of the most common myths that I typically hear from clients about seed oils. The first one, seed oils are inflammatory. Now, we know from looking at all of that data that there is absolutely no human research to support this claim. And in fact, we see the opposite. Omega-3 fatty acids found in seed oils have actually been shown to reduce inflammation. So that's something that you can share with your clients. The second myth is that seed oils are easily oxidized and are therefore bad. Now, whether or not seed oils are actually oxidized during production is actually still up for debate. But as Mark said, it really doesn't matter because we're looking at what happens when people actually consume seed oils, and we're not seeing levels of oxidative markers rising. So you can share that with your clients. And they also may find this fact pretty interesting. Omega-3 fatty acids, which have a health halo among most nutrition communities, are more susceptible to oxidation because they have more double bonds, if we refer back to that fatty acid nomenclature from the beginning. And finally, I guess this isn't a myth, it's actually true, but there are myths surrounding it, is that seed oils are highly processed. Sure, they are processed. But we know that processing isn't a main factor in the nutritional profile of a food. Many foods that our clients are eating every day that they already consider healthy, and you can go through these in their food log and point them out to them, are very nutritious. And processing actually helps to make many foods safe for people to consume. So kind of debunking both the myths about seed oils as well as the myths of processing hand in hand is going to be really helpful. Now, these simple explanations may be sufficient for some people, but in our current social media climate where statistics reign supreme and social media hustlers are throwing around cherry-picked studies and sciencey sounding words, you might need to elaborate for some people. So I think this is a good point to share some of the most powerful and easy to digest statistics. So here are a few on seed oils and heart health that I like to share with clients. The most powerful statistic that always just stands out in my mind is the one from the American Heart Association position statement on dietary fats, that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated vegetable oil can reduce cardiovascular disease risk by up to 30%. That is huge. That's an impactful number. And that is about the same degree as achieved through statin treatment. So that can kind of also speak to the point of accusing us health professionals of constantly trying to push drugs and be in bed with big pharma. Next, I'd move on to explaining the key differences between unsaturated and saturated fats. Consumers are very confused, as we saw with the data on the seed oil perception. A lot of people don't even really understand what a seed oil is, where it falls in this spectrum of different dietary fats. So you can share with them that it's part of a larger umbrella of unsaturated fats, including some of our health angels, olive oil and avocado oil, and that all of these oils have been shown to lower cholesterol and reduce cardiovascular disease risk. Similarly, they might not be very clear on what saturated fat is and where it's found, so you can elucidate that for them by sharing the different types of foods that fall under that category, and the research showing that replacing them with vegetable oils reduces cholesterol and decreases cardiovascular disease risk. Now finally, and I think this is the most important, is that you want to emphasize these facts by sharing that this is a scientific consensus. This isn't the nefarious US government trying to poison you. This is a global health consensus by unbiased health organizations that unsaturated fats are beneficial for health. So a lot of people in our day and age are on social media. The algorithms are repeatedly feeding them information that they've heard or that they're seeking out, and it feels like an echo chamber. To them, it feels like everyone agrees that seed oils are bad. They don't know that there's a whole other environment, the scientific community, which has all of this evidence from decades showing the reverse. So really explaining to them that this isn't some fringe idea. Next, we want to emphasize balance over fear. What really sets us apart from this seed oil hysteria is thoughtful evaluation of the facts and the ability to understand the nuance of nutrition. We know that choosing foods that are rich in unsaturated fats over saturated fats most of the time is beneficial for health. But we also know that having some pancakes with butter or an ice cream cone on the weekend isn't going to kill you. And that's really where we have the opportunity to set ourselves apart from this hyperbolic fear-mongering. Nutrition is about the totality of your diet, what you eat most of the time. It's not about this black and white thinking about foods and ingredients. And that's where we can differentiate ourselves as health professionals. Again, since most people can't identify what a seed oil is, it can be helpful to walk them through the different options, talk about the nutritional profiles and their best uses in cooking. Here you can see canola oil and soybean oil both have a very neutral flavor. As we saw in Mark's slides, they are also a really good source of omega-3 fatty acids, which a lot of people aren't getting enough of. And they can be used in different high heat applications like frying, but they're also great for sauces and dressings and baking. Sunflower and safflower oil also have a mild flavor, and they have an even higher smoke point, so they can be used for even higher heat cooking, again, frying, roasting, baking. And grapeseed oil is high in vitamin E and phenolic compounds, and it is also great for high heat cooking. They're all great for high heat cooking. So finally, we want to help our clients figure out how to make healthy changes in their diets and really incorporating more unsaturated fat, not just seed oils, but across the board. So if you have clients who are used to having their morning toast or bagels with some cream cheese or nut butter, an easy swap would be to encourage something like nut butter, mashed avocado, or hummus, which would not only provide those healthy fats, but also some fiber or a little protein. You can share easy salad dressing recipes that they can make at home using soybean oil or canola oil and some spices or vinegar. You can teach them about how chia seeds and ground flax seeds are really high in omega-3 fatty acids, and they make an excellent substitution for eggs and baked goods because they create a very viscous binder. You can also talk about how oil can be easily replace butter in baked goods and still provide that moisture. And of course, as we just talked about, all of these high heat oils are great for high heat cooking and instead of butter. So to summarize everything we've discussed and how to translate this to your clients, number one, we know that seed oils are not only not healthy, they likely do the opposite of what a lot of these claims purport. Two, when discussing this information with your clients, and really all nutrition myths, it's important to stay curious rather than critical. Three, these days people, they want facts, and they want easy to digest statistics. That's what they're getting from other people on social media. And we need to share these in order to combat the misinformation. Lastly, though, we want to set ourselves apart from the fear-mongering online by driving home the message that good nutrition is about balance and the totality of your diet, not single ingredients or foods. Thank you.
So quiet. What happened? It's time for questions, just in case you haven't figured that out.
It's rumbling on the stage.
All right, questions? I'm coming. I know you.
Thanks for a great presentation. I know, like a lot of dietitians, we've been answering these questions for the media. Where I live in Seattle, let me tell you, this is a thing, the Hateful Eight. And there's a big buzz about the hexane. So like the consumer co-op I belong to wrote a whole article about seed oils, but then they go, we're gonna err on the side of safety and we will not sell products that have used hexane in processing of seed oils. Not that there's not enough data to show that it's not harmful, and that in Europe they have hexane limits and we don't. And how would you recommend, I know what I say, but I want to hear what you recommend we say to consumers about the hexane issue in processing seed oils?
Well, I usually say that the trace amounts of hexane that are potentially found in some seed oils are not enough to cause any clinically relevant outcomes. And we can see that in the large body and decades of research on these oils that have been produced using hexane. So in many cases, there is no residue, and even if there is, it's important to look at the human health outcome data.
Yeah, the limits in Europe limits in Canada are 10 milligrams per kilogram oil, and the limit in Europe is 1 milligram per kilogram oil, and average hexane content is about a half a milligram. So it's much, much lower. You could, in that paper that I referenced in Nutrition Today that's open access, there's actually some calculations about how much oil you'd have to drink to exceed the upper limit. So I understand the concern. It's a neurotoxin. It's going to resonate with consumers. But again, in the end, what we care about is the impact of the oil on our health. And I mean, we could have gone on for hours citing all the studies. It's actually hard to identify, not being very articulate, the anti-seed oil argument is really based on primarily on some strange correlations like I showed between the rise in obesity and seed oil consumption, mechanistic studies, what might happen in theory, it's some molecular pathway, and then animal studies. And those are all fine for generating hypotheses, justifying additional research. But in the end, we have all these clinical trials, I mean, hundreds of clinical trials and hundreds of observational studies of really high quality showing the healthfulness of these oils.
I also like to point out that we're exposed to much more hexane from gasoline fumes. That's the main source of exposure for people, and it far outweighs anything you could potentially.
Her brother works for Tesla, so that's why she's saying that.
Hi, thank you for this presentation. This was very enlightening. Just curious to know if you have any comments about the quality of seed oils between brands, where it's grown, how it's processed. I mean, is there research out there? Do you have a comment about that?
Go ahead.
I don't. I think, again, as to speaking to your clients' fears and anxieties and validating their position, if people are concerned about processing method, you can say, well, you can get a cold pressed seed oil if you want. So you can both explain the science and then also tell them that there are many options, and let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater if you do feel strongly about one aspect. I don't think it matters. I don't have specific brands.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be some natural variation in the fatty acid content of the particular soys there's 600 varieties of soybeans, so there will be some variation. But the processing steps, generally speaking, are very similar. And again, you can get expeller pressed at low temperature, cold pressed, if you're interested. But the industrial processes that are used are because it's the most efficient use of the oil, and it very effectively eliminates a lot of potentially toxic compounds like free fatty acids and gums and certain phospholipids.
Just two questions. The first quick one, did I hear you say there's over 600 varieties of soybeans?
Oh, I misspoke. There's 10,000. Literally, I was referring to a paper that actually analyzed 633 varieties. So yeah, there's thousands.
Okay, well that just blew me away, but...
And there's 550,000 soybean farmers in the U.S., which is often not appreciated as well.
Oh my, okay. Well, having worked for the Texas Department of Agriculture, even though we don't grow many soybeans here, thank you for that. But my question really is about the history of soybeans and the relationship to cancer, and I'm thinking about breast cancer. Back in the day, so to speak, there was some concern about a causal relationship, and I think your slide that indicated the pathway to hormones would probably explain that, but can you kind of update us on where the research is on that particular topic?
Yes, so thanks for the question. Gets me away from seed oils for the moment, which I always the concern about soybeans was the isoflavones, commonly referred to as plant estrogens in soybeans. They're not in the oil at all. And we've since gained, our understanding of isoflavones and the phytoestrogens have really evolved over the past 10 or 15 years. The controversy was started by animal studies actually specifically studies in mice where they removed the ovaries and moved the immune system and implanted cancer cells into the animals. First study was published in 1998, but the human data actually show that there's no adverse effect of consuming soy foods or isoflavones on markers of breast cancer risk. So these studies include 20 studies that looked at breast tissue density, 6 studies that looked at in vivo breast cell proliferation by taking biopsies, no adverse effect. And the observational studies show that if you consume soy after a diagnosis of breast cancer, even if it's estrogen receptor positive, your risk of recurrence is reduced and your mortality is reduced. So the position of American Institute for Cancer Research, American Cancer Society, is that soy foods can be safely consumed by women with breast cancer. And I just co-authored a paper that looked at the effect of soy in women being treated for breast cancer therapy with, for breast cancer, either tamoxifen or aromatase inhibitors. So that's also open access if you want more. So it's really unrelated to the oils.
We have time for one more.
Hi, thank you for the interesting presentation. Just similar to hexane, what are your thoughts on BHA and BHT and cancer risk? I know that's also been talking about lately.
The pesticides you're talking about?
The BHA.
Oh, BHT.
Yeah, BHA.
You know, I'll talk to you afterwards because it's outside my area of expertise. So in a public setting, I don't like to talk without facts, but I'm happy to do that on a personal level. So I really, I'm ill-equipped to answer that question. I haven't studied it.
Also, one more question about the canola oil. I think it's rapeseed oil, actually, right? So there's a lot of controversy about all this industrial use, and what are your thoughts on that? That's what I hear from patients all the time.
Just
About the processing of it? Is that what the question was?
They're talking about that uric acid or something like that that comes out of the rapeseed oil.
That it's neurotoxic?
Yeah, I hear that all the time. It's kind of like...
I haven't heard that specifically. I wonder again if that's in relation to the use of hexane as a solvent. And I would refer back to the studies that Mark shared and showing that using omega-6 fatty acid-rich oils, including canola oil, actually has beneficial effects on brain health.
Is it the uric acid are you talking?
Yeah, that's the one I was saying, uric acid for the...
Yeah, the canola oil, especially here, is really low in uric acid. A variety of bean was developed, seed was developed specifically with the low content of uric acid.
So that's different from the home cooking use rapeseed oil, because I know that the industrial use, something like that, right? Are you familiar?
So much about that topic, I'll be honest.
That's okay. Just thought about it. Thank you.
We can do one quick one. Last call. You're pointing. Where are you pointing? Oh, right in front of me.
So in the late 80s, they changed out lard and tallow in fast food operations for what was originally hardened trans fat full vegetable oils, which have now been replaced with low trans fat liquid frying oils. You talked about how those oils are less stable and more likely to form like AGEs and reactive oxygen species. So what, do you have any safety concerns around the use of liquid vegetable oils in, excuse me, in like fast food frying operations?
Want to go first?
Hasn't heart disease risk decreased?
We're talking about, I think, you're talking about frying, deep frying of the use of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm more concerned about these fast food operations now replacing the vegetable oils with beef tallow and us seeing heart disease risks increase. So I think there's been some evidence of some changes in the oils with repeated heating, but again, we're not seeing the human health outcome data reflect that there's been increases in disease risk. So whereas we do know that replacing unsaturated fat with saturated fat will increase heart disease risk. So yeah, I'm a lot more concerned about the opposite.
Yeah, it's a food science question, but in the studies I've seen, when they test the oils, they're refrying many more times than would actually be the case at a retail establishment. And generally speaking, by the time you would be forming really potentially toxic oxidized metabolites, you would actually smell that. They're volatile. Some of them are volatile compounds. And there is, for the functional reasons, there's a greater use now of oils for frying that are high in monounsaturated fat because they oxidize. They're less likely to oxidize, so you can use the oil longer. So there's an economic savings that goes along with that. And then also you can add even small amounts of antioxidants to the oil, and they greatly prevent the oxidative effects.
I will say further, we don't have evidence that feeding oxidized or consuming oxidized oils actually increases oxidative markers in the body. There is one study, I don't know if I'm allowed to mention this without clearing it first, but on omega-3 fatty acids that had been oxidized and they were fed to human participants, and it did not raise the level of oxidative markers in the body. So maybe more research needs to be done on that, but I don't think we have evidence at this point to even suggest that it would produce the outcome that people are worried about.
Thank you so much, Mark and Whitney.